Welcome to the 8th iteration of the church history class here. This time we're going to be covering the major trends of the evangelization of the North. We have seen how the new kings are coming in and new administrations are coming into the countries which were once occupied by the Roman Empire. And these kings, the church is getting in there and is bringing the gospel to these people. It's a new missionary field. Corresponding with that, oddly enough, is the rise of the papacy. Now, I'll go into more as when we get there. The papacy obviously has been there since the beginning, and there were many notable popes. However, the institution, the idea of appealing to the papacy or having it as a kind of a court of appeals is something that really begins in this era. The papacy is very savvy in using this mechanism. And finally, the birth of Islam. Really, among the travesties of Europe, few things can be compared to the birth of Islam. Europe was not ready for this. Europe was coming out of the idea that the Roman Empire had administratively gone away, and these new kings are coming in and they're skirmishing with each other. And all of a sudden, out of Arabia and through on both sides across Africa, and then up around the Fertile Crescent into the Byzantine world, a new force would come around, and they were desert dwellers, so the way that they fought war was very different the way Europeans fought war. And they weren't ready. They got hit with this, and it was a real shock. So, the evangelization of the North. New dynasties are being formed in the church at the center of this. As kings were crowned in the newly formed kingdoms of Europe, the bishops made sure that each king knew from whence his power derived. Bishops also used monks and canons to make sure, to make sure that the ceremonies surrounding royalty were magnificent, which reinforced people's impression of royal power and reinforced the church's influence. Every aspect of the dynastic and the royal in this, the church came in and made sure that it had all the pomp that it could provide to really booster up these kings in their various activities. The marriages between dynastic houses, the church came in, and beautiful ceremonies. Many of your music that came in, that kind of stuff. Gregorian chant is really being developed. Gregory the Great was the one that began the idea. It's incredibly developed during this period for the sake of enriching these ceremonies, making the kings and the ceremonies surrounding them, truly magnificent. Marriages were solemnized, indigenous bishops were chosen and enthroned. The church made sure that its influence was felt in all aspects of life. Very quickly, as they were having the Franks came in, or the Anglo-Saxons came in, or whatever, they made sure that they found, as they evangelized an area, they found bishops who knew the people, who spoke the language. They were trained oftentimes in Rome, where they were trained in a major cathedral, taught the theology, taught how to sing and everything else, and then sent back. We saw that with St. Patrick, and we'll see that with others, sent back to their own people to bring the gospel. But they brought with them this knowledge of liturgy, this knowledge of language, this knowledge of singing, so that the magnificence of Christianity, that when kings did anything, that there was a pomp and ceremony behind it, which reinforced the idea of the beauty of what was going on and the magnificence that God was behind this. France. The Germanic tribe of the Franks had arrived in the Roman Empire in the late 300s. Clovis, their king, was baptized in 508 and inaugurated the Merovingian dynasty. It's odd because named for Merovech, and no one's exactly sure who that is. The name means mighty in battle, and so may very well have been a nickname for Clovis, the first king. Interestingly enough, Clovis, as the medieval manuscripts continue, Clovis, the first letter got more and more elaborate. So Clovis is actually the name Louis. The C finally disappeared because they thought it was just the illustration on the page. So Clovis becomes Louis. That's actually where the name Louis comes from. Clovis, the first Germanic king, to be baptized, and thus Frances called the eldest daughter of the church. By the 600, the Merovingian dynasty, aided by the church, is working to convert all the people of what is now France. Again, being trained up and sending out, keeping this standard of worship, the standard of education, the standard of what they were doing, brought this magnificence of Christianity and tried to spread it out to all the people, these various tribes of the various areas. Obviously, there was more than just more than under Clovis, one king among many, but the church would go out there and would encounter these peoples and bring, and again, I said like St. Patrick did, he showed up with a retinue, singing psalms, showing this idea of the majesty of the Christian faith. Here's Clovis being baptized, and there's another image I didn't choose to use because it was kind of too rough. There's a whole thing of when they're going to anoint Clovis. They couldn't find the ampule or the little vial there. They were looking for it. A bird flew down with an ampule and it landed on, now I can't think of the bishop's name, Remigius, San Remigius, given to his hands this apparently like miraculous bottle of chrism. They have it preserved in Notre Dame, which they anoint the French kings with. Here is the Merovingian and then the tributary dynasties here. You can see how much bigger this is than modern day France. Aquitaine, Burgundy, Nutria, and Austrasia, those are the general areas. And again, these were, Burgundy was known for the Burgundians, another tribe, Aquitanians, and you can see the various areas. Much of what is now Germany was at that point in time France under the Merovingian dynasty. England. The island of England was evangelized early by the Celts, and Christianity was well established by the 400s and 500s, as we saw last time. The inhabitants were mostly Romanized at the end of the 500s by St. Augustine. Still, they practiced a Christianity that was heavily influenced by the Celts and remained dedicated to this form of Christianity. It tended to be a rather independent people. With the arrivals of the Anglos and Saxons, a new chapter was begun. These Germanic peoples were pagans, rather warlike, which posed a challenge to the Christian church. You can see here what Roman Britain here as such, and then you can see where they come from, which are basically Dutch, and some of the Danish would come down, swept in over the centuries, and pushed the second thing, the redhead, pushed the old Britons off more and more to the west of the island, thus call it Wales, which in English is Gaul, Gallican, which means Celtic, and down into Galicia, which is up so you have Wales, and then you have Brittany in France, where the Britons were, who were the Celts. So these Anglo-Saxons push the Celts off to the west side of the island, and a lot of them jump down into France. That's how we end up with Wales, which were the Welsh or the Gauls, the Celts, and then down into western France. So that you can see here, once they settle in, you have West Saxons, Mercians, Kent, East Angles, Northumbrians, and finally you have them settling into their various kingdoms. Many of the names remain today, even though obviously there's been a lot of moving around since that time. But these are all where the original settlements were of these Anglos and Saxons in England. With the Germanic names of all the various places here, you can see, and the more you move west, the more the names become Gallicanized, and more west you see, the more of the German. Northumbria here I come calling out because Northumbria is a history of England is fascinating as far as its Christianization, and it contains any number of things. And Northumbria is key, whereas the Northumbrians hadn't gotten the bolt of the invasion. They become really key later on. Great effort was made to Christianize the Anglo-Saxon peoples. From Gregory the Great's mission to the Angles sprang up many saints to continue the mission. Female evangelists. In England, women played a key role in the evangelization of England. Queens insisted on their husbands and children being baptized. Daughters of kings defied their fathers and became nuns, setting up schools, which educated a whole generation of Christian women. The island of England boasts almost more female saints than any of the other countries in Europe. The number of queens, a number of sisters who started off in England and then went on, either stayed in England and helped Christianize England, or went on to the continent, or went on to Germany and such, is quite numerous. Ethelred, sorry about these names, they liked consonants back in those days, was an East Anglian princess of Fenland and Northumbria, Queen and Abbess of Ely. She's an Anglo-Saxon saint, also known as Elfreda or Audrey, as they tried to Latinize some of these names they couldn't pronounce, especially in religious contexts. She was daughter of Anna, the king of East Anglia, and her siblings were Wendreda and Seaborg of Ely, both of whom eventually retired from secular life and founded abbeys. Ethelred first made an early marriage in about 652 to Tonberg, a chief or prince of the South Weir. She managed to persuade her husband to respect her vow of perpetual virginity that she had made prior to their marriage. Upon his death in 665, she retired to the Isle of Ely, which she received from Tonberg as a mourning gift, I guess as a dowry of some sort. Aelfred of Whitby, the daughter of the king of Northumbria, she defied her father who wanted her to marry and became a nun instead in the monastery of Ethelred, which we just saw. She established monasteries of women all over northern England, attracted many aristocratic ladies to her convents. They in turn educated a whole generation of women in Christianity, which hastened the island's conversion. Ethelbert of Kent. She was from Kent in southern England and was espoused to King Edwin of Northumbria, so good up in the north. She insisted that Edwin and the children be baptized, and their marriage triggered the initial phase of the conversion of the pagans of the north to Christianity. She was key because she was from the south and brought that up there and insisted that anybody who worked with her was a Christian, and so prejudiced the Christians and such, and really brought Christianity to the north. Ethelberg of Fermotier. Ethelberg was one of the daughters of the king of East Anglia, or King Anna of East Anglia, although she was probably illegitimate. Her sisters were Witburga and Sithrith, who was abbess of Fermotier Abbey in Brie in France. Sigsburg and Ethelred were also abbesses of Ely. Ethelberg and Sithrith were sent to the nunnery of Fermotier in France for their education. While there, Ethelred became a nun and eventually succeeded Ethelberg as abbess. As abbess, Ethelred began to work on a church in honor of the 12 apostles, which was left unfinished at her death in 664. At her request, she was buried in the church. After 7 years, a decision was made to move her bones to a nearby church of St. Stephen. Her body was found to be incorrupted. Hilda of Whitby, or Hildy or Hild, was a saint of the early church in Britain. She was the founder and first abbess of the monastery of Whitby, which was chosen as the venue for the Synod of Whitby in 664. An important figure in the Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England, she was abbess in several convents, recognized for her wisdom that drew kings to her for her advice. Hilda of Whitby is amazing. I think there's actually some writings from her I could look up, but her influence that she held in England during this Christianization period was exceptional. Aelfred of Whitby. St. Aelfred was the daughter of King Oswiu of Northumbria, and Aelfred, she was abbess of the Whitby Abbey. The abbess of nuns were known for their skills in medicine. From the death of her kinswoman Hilda, we just saw in 680, first jointly with her mother, then alone, Aelfred was particularly known for her skills in surgery and personal attention to patients, as was Hilda, who was known for her personalized medical care. Fascinating piece of how medicine was developed in that area. One of the things that a lot of your modern pagans will go back to was a lot of herbal remedies, and a lot of these things were tried under these. It wasn't. It was the nuns. It was the nuns who were developing all these all this kind of stuff that all these like pagan Wiccans like to claim were the witches before Christianity. It was not. English domestic spirituality. The effect of women so early on the Benedictine experience meant that a particular school of spirituality grew up called the domestic spirituality. It was contrary to the spiritual combat so popular in other schools. That's a bit of a later thing. It's still around. They use it in the Crusade. It's really big with the Jesuits, which I realize is centuries from now. But this establishes an English school fairly early on. A speculative affective synthesis. This is the conviction that our spiritual experiences should always be guided by what the church has taught in doctrine, and that doctrine should be lifted up in prayer and meditation. It is the insistence that prayer, worship, and life itself are grounded upon dogmatic fact, that in everyday religious experience, head and heart are wedded. We see the spiritual harmony in Anselm's treatises, and also Julian of Norwich's, and again, this is centuries from now, Revelations of Divine Love, where every distressing detail of the Passion is related, almost with treatise on the doctrine of the atonement. Unity of Church Militant. There's a deep family relationship between the most prominent church leaders and humble parishioners. This is a key element of what the English church will become. A unique humanism and optimism. This is a biblical virtue of hope in the midst of the endless details of everyday life. It maintains cheerfulness despite setbacks because it knows that God loves his people and will bring them to victory in the end. It is as Julian of Norwich, again 14th century saint, says, all-conquering hope. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. The foundation of Christian life is in the liturgy. This is the worship in which we participate on Sunday, Eucharist, and also in the daily office, morning and evening prayer. But obviously this foresees the Church of England, but it's a fascinating. This idea began back in the 600s. These have come down to us from the early church and have been steeped in powerful prayer, prayerful meditation, and theological precision. They teach us how to pray. All these prayers and meditations are biblical, either by direct quotation or indirect reflection. The Book of Common Prayer is used by both the Archbishop of Canterbury and the schoolgirls, confirms that Anglicans have a deep-rooted distrust of hypoclericalism and the idea that only the clergy make up the real church. This is obviously a more modern reflection on this. The key thing is that early on, this idea that, as you say, what the Archbishop of Canterbury prays is the same thing that any schoolgirl in England would pray. Obviously, the language may be a struggle for the schoolgirl, and the Archbishop may say, okay, he may see more into the text than the schoolgirl, but really, it's the same prayer. This idea of the unity of the island, not necessarily, and you talk about hyperclericalism, and we'll get into that in the late Middle Ages, that the church's prayer really began to be relegated to the monks, the nuns, and the priests. They said it in Latin. There was this whole very complex system where most of your lay folk were given rosaries and given smaller devotional things to pray and not kept linked into this prayer of the church. In England, at this point in time, and again, they will restart this, the idea that the whole of the island prays the same way, be they archbishop or be they young schoolgirl. Bede, one of the key saints of this period here. Bede is an interesting saint in that he was a Benedictine, and I'll go into this more in the write-up here. You can see that I wanted to call out this idea. If you can see the effects I showed you last time of this, and this is a Romanized. This is not Celtic. This is Bede. He's Romanized, and he's living up in Wearmouth, which is over that northern area. He's part of that northern renaissance of Christianity that's growing up there. But you can see even how plain his church was. Bede of Wearmouth. He was a monk of Wearmouth, an Anglo-Saxon monastery in northern England. Bede lived his whole life in that monastery, being given as a young man, and remained there until his death. It is through Bede we get the best glimpse of England in the 600s from his book, The History of the English Church and People. The picture we get is one of turmoil. Anglo-Saxon peoples often distrusted the Celts and found them to be dangerous, rough people. Bede is even rather prejudiced against them, finding fault with their tonsure. They shave their foreheads and darken their eyes in a skull-like appearance. I wanted to read the next piece here. Do I have it in the next one? I wanted to read this one. No, it's the whole thing on the. I think I mentioned in this here, one of the slides. Beta's kind of funny because Beta's Anglo-Saxon. He came in with this new bunch of invaders, and they're Christianizing the whole country. And when he writes, he talks about how the church was, the island was pagan before his arrival. There were no Christians around. And you're like, wait a minute, the Celts were Christian before you showed up, because of how different culturally the Anglo-Saxons were from the Celts. And the Celts, and I'm going to show you this. Now, this is an interesting, you don't know anything about tonsure. It's a couple of minutes, a minute or two. It's not that long. He makes a mistake, and I will stop it when he begins the mistake and explain what they have here. But it's a fascinating piece of history. Look at this painting. It's St. Francis and Pope Honorius. You can probably find them up. It's the hair. This is not the more you look, the more this haircut shows religious divide. One style is even longer that could be invaded by the Roman Catholic Church. The scalp is a symbol of faith, but it's also about Hair's religious rite extends far beyond Christianity. Some Buddhist monks shave their heads, and some Orthodox Jews don't shave the corners of their heads. The Catholic monks were known for centuries for their particularly distinctive hairstyle. This haircut with the center shave is called a tonsure. It started in the 4th or 5th century, and the most recognizable is the coronal tonsure, possibly modeled on Jesus' crown of thorns on the cross. It's actually one of 3 types. The coronal is the Roman or Petrine tonsure, after St. Peter. There's also the Pauline tonsure, named after St. Paul and used more commonly in Eastern Orthodoxy. It is a fully shaved head. But in the Dark Ages, there was a 3rd tonsure, too, and that's the shape that largely disappeared from the church. That hairstyle was a visible symbol of divergent faiths, and that's the reason that it was banned. When Pope Gregory sent missionaries from Rome. All right. Actually, I'll let you see what he says, but then I'll tell you the other one. To the British Isles in the late 6th century, he found differences between the Roman Catholic Church and Celtic Church, ones that revealed serious disagreements about religious practice.
You live on the other side of the Atlantic, and in these islands, the controversies that developed in the 7th century, they were very widespread. They covered both the south and the north of Britain and all of Ireland. That brought the customs of the Roman Church up against the customs of the churches in Britain and in Ireland.
Celtic Catholicism was out of sync with the Roman Catholic Church. Roman Catholics would later use the differences between them to portray Celtic Catholicism as pagan, or even as an offshoot celebrating the power-hungry magician, Simon Magus. There were concrete disputes. Most importantly, they disagreed on when to celebrate Easter, and another significant disagreement was the shape of the tonsure.
The Roman Church used a coronal or a circular tonsure. Churches in the British Isles use a different shaped tonsure.
McCarthy wanted to learn the shape of this tonsure because it represented the split in the Roman and Celtic churches. He thought the old guesses about its design were wrong. You can't just scroll through photos of 7th century monk haircuts. Figuring out the shape of the tonsure these monks used is a detective story. It required McCarthy to parse texts, like the Book of Kells, and records of old letters. From that, he could figure out the shape.
When it was viewed from the front, it superficially resembled the Roman tonsure. When it was viewed from the rear, it was cut straight between the 2 ears.
These old texts and illustrations only gave McCarthy a view.
All right, I'm going to stop it here. He goes on to talk about how it is a triangle, which is not correct. Now, it is true that we really don't know very well about it, but there are texts about them darkening their eyes. It was also based roughly on the Byzantine tonsure, which is you don't cut your hair at all. I don't know where he get the idea of it shaving your head. Oddly enough, and just as a side note, that Christians, slavery in ancient times, you'd shave your head. So if you ran away, they could see that you didn't have slave garb on, but you had your head shaved. They knew you were a runaway slave, and they could catch you right away, which made it tough. If you ran away as a slave in ancient Rome, you had to hide for 4 weeks at least, until your hair grew out enough that you could comb it and not look like a slave. It was a way of making sure they captured slaves. And some early Christians began doing that as like the slaves of our Lord. But the Eastern, they would let their hair grow. They'd grow the beard and they grew their hair. What the Celtics would do is they would shave the front of the front around there, and they would darken the eyes, making it look like a skull. So they would shave around and you can see it there. They show a little bit how the front of the top of the crown of the head is shaved. And obviously it would depend on how far back it would grow in some. But they would just shave the front of the forehead, and they would darken their eyes. They talk about they're darkening their eyes with charcoal. So you look at them, they look like a skull. It was very morbid, very odd looking. And the Roman Anglo-Saxons were having none of it. So Bede informs us that the island had been abandoned by the time that he got there. The tonsure, the crown of their head. Bede was so bold to say Christianity had left the island before the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons. He claims that the Celts were never Christians. This is not a really good, but you can see on each of those guys, the forehead is open. Again, there really aren't any good photos. You have to go back to the writings of it and assume, but they talk about how the awful look and they darken the eyes. The idea, and you can see this, all of them, their foreheads are shaved. I mean, that was the Celtic tonsure. St. Cuthbert. Was another monk turned bishop. He became Bishop of Durham in the north, was very influential in the evangelization of England. St. Cuthbert was amazing in his ability to go and meet some of these pagan things and treat them well with respect and gain their friendship, and then talk to them about Christianity was very, very important. He not only was he a bishop, but he was just a very humble man, and his humility and his way of dealing with the Druids or whoever it was that he was dealing with among these pagans was really, they couldn't hold anything against him. He was not, because a lot of times you have colonizers or whatever have you, they'll do it in a much more military fashion, as we'll see coming up. Cuthbert was very humble, was very respectful, and his kindness did a great deal to help the conversion, especially of the north. St. Boniface, he actually is British, but it will be sent off to evangelize Europe. The British saints will be immensely influential in the conversion of the rest of Europe. We'll actually see Alcuin, who is in Charlemagne's court in 2 centuries, is British as well. So the English were extremely, he was trained in a monastery and sent off to evangelize Germany. And here's a holy card. Holy Boniface leaves England to bring the faith to the Dutch. And then it says, go therefore, baptize all nations in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, and I am with you even to the end of the ages, or end of the world. The rise of the papacy. As I said, the papacy has been around since the beginning. There's always been, the Pope was Peter was in Antioch, and then Peter dies on Vatican Hill in Rome, and the idea of this papacy, and Rome became a holy city, and the people who sat on the chair of Peter continued to believe that they were a successor of this primacy. The exact nature of the primacy was still in dispute, but there was a certain primacy about the office of the Pope. There were a number of bad popes which did damage to the respect of the papacy. However, as this period of history comes in, papacy is very savvy and becomes very important from what they do here. Papacy, as I said, had been around, but this is the beginning of the church. The chair of St. Peter, first at Antioch and then in Rome, was respected as a unique office. There was discussion, advocacy, dissension about the see of Peter and its role, but a certain primum inter pares, or first among equals, was generally considered the see of Rome. But it's still early, and the papacy had not yet become the center of the church, insisting that bishops, emperors, and later kings should all obey the see of Rome. There were notable popes in the first century, Leo the Great, for example, who stood against the invading armies and was very influential, as well as, of course, Gregory the Great. The power of the papacy was still being formulated. As Christianity spread and encountered new peoples, it became a very useful way to end contentions by appealing to the papacy. This is what the papacy did here. The early councils did not appeal to the papacy, but as the Western Church became more coalesced, the papacy became a key element. Popes took the lead in the evangelization effort. This is really key. So you saw it with St. Gregory the Great. They actually began to send out people trained in Rome to these various areas, which was a great way to make sure everybody was Roman Catholic. And again, they were sent off and thus have been sent by the Pope with the intention of evangelizing, which was great. They were evangelizing. There was also a way of keeping the influence focused on Rome. It would strengthen their position, give the office of validity that it would exploit in the future. Gregory the Great was possibly the greatest pope of the early medieval period. His manner and equanimity were huge in establishing the papacy as a moderating force and center for evangelization. And this is the key thing here. Papacy worked with kings to confirm and strengthen the burgeoning Christian kingdoms. Papacy arbitrated disputes between bishops and princes. Rome became a reliable court of appeals for medieval Europe. What it was that when there was an issue, the papacy would take the issue, and they pulled in the best and the brightest of canon lawyers, of theologians, of liturgists, and Rome would look at any question and would issue a decision. And many of those decisions were very wise. The papacy was very careful to make sure that it respected, people's opinion. You have a lot of very wise popes, and the papacy was very good at reasonably bringing contention to an end. And what it allowed was obviously a king, for example, or a bishop they're having a fight. It goes to Rome. Rome decides in their favor. It also makes them beholden to Rome. So it strengthens Rome's role as this court of appeals. But Rome was very savvy in these days to make sure that they were very reasonable. I mean, obviously there were dynastic struggles. There were any number of problems in here. But when you look at the decisions made, they're made based on how long someone has been there, how the character of the person. They're generally very good decisions. They say this is also when a lot of the Roman court fashions came in. A lot of it goes back to this idea of the glory of Christendom, how glorious Christianity is, the glory of the offices that these people would have. And again, they brought in great theologians and canon lawyers and on and on and on, linguists, to be able to articulate the faith to these nations that they were evangelizing. So a great deal of effort is put into making sure that staying with Christian, what they basically did was they took what Rome used to offer in the sense of stability, power, and judgment, and put it in the church. And the church is taking on this role both visibly with what they're wearing and what they're doing, their ceremonies. They're hearkening back to this idea when Rome could do this, when Rome would defend, when Rome would decide. And the church is taking this up specifically out of the papacy, which is again based in Rome. The papal court, the cardinals and archdeacons made it their business to reply to inquiries and resolve conflicts with an efficiency that allowed the papacy to become a tribunal for religious questions, also civil questions as well. This gave increased validity to the office, and while not all accepted the Pope as a final authority, the many wholly educated men who were elected during this period helped strengthen the papacy as an institution. Again, examples here of the kind of pomp and such that was this is actually kind of a later medieval here, but you get the idea. The rise of Islam. As I say, this was a real blow to Christian Europe because they were in no way saw this coming. When this happened, and when Islam rolled into the Europe, the Christian Europe that was still trying to get itself reorganized, they were not ready for the attitude, the philosophy, or the warlike nature of Islam. Muhammad was born in 570. He was born in Mecca. His father, a tribal leader, died not long after his birth, and his mother died when he was about 6, leaving him an orphan raised by his grandmother. He was a somewhat solitary boy who enjoyed quiet time at Jabal al-Nur, which is a cave. One day he claimed the angel Gabriel appeared to him and gave him a revelation, which he copied down as the Quran or dictation. You've heard of the Qumran caves. Quran are the same word. It means dictation. So Quran, obviously they spell Quran now a lot of different ways, but it's this word that means dictation. The dictation did not end that one night, but continued for many years. Sometimes Muhammad would hear the voice in different places and would write down on whatever was handy, including the hide of whatever animal he was working with. Thus, the surahs or chapters of the Quran are called by whatever name he wrote on. You have the pig and the horse as these surahs. And I don't actually know that much about Islam deep down, but I've heard that he actually would just begin writing on whatever he had. Oddly enough, and this is very much my own observation, again, I'm not especially talented with Islam, the first couple of revelations are actually really not all that bad. It's as you go on and on that you run into the stuff that really is, there are three things unclean: a dog, a horse, and the Holy Trinity. And Jesus, blah, blah, blah. Are you the Son of God? Oh, no, it's not me. Generally, it's much later. And you can see almost the corruption in a sense. Not that I'm saying that Muhammad was a true prophet, but the early stuff really is much more innocuous and might have been divine. As you get along, you're like, this doesn't read like the original stuff. Here's the cave on your left here, where Muhammad would go in there to read and pray. And there's an image, probably, I don't know, but of the angel Gabriel visiting Muhammad. You'll see that Muhammad's face is blanked out. It is against the law in Islam to depict Muhammad. So he either wears a veil over his face or his face is blanked out like that. It all centered around a book. The book was the Quran, and there is actually no official translation of the Quran. To read, you should read the Quran in Arabic. Any translation made is not official, and Islam does not stand behind it. The book is in Arabic. If you want to read it, go back to Arabic. So any good Muslim will study it in Arabic. But it was an interesting thing how you can see some of the Jewish aspects of it, very frankly, very few Christian aspects. But this idea of reliance upon a book was key. And Arabic, which was the official language of the Quran. It's actually ancient Arabic and is difficult. If you read Arabic today, it does not mean you're going to read the Quran easily. There are extra vowels. There are all kinds of things. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you can say it's an ancient Arabic. I mean, one book I read, an analogy. The analogy is it's like trying to compare modern English to like the English of like Chaucer,
Right,
or like a Beowulf or something.
Right.
It's like that type.
No, it is, and even that's absolutely true. Even more so is Italian to Old Latin. You pick up modern Italian, you pick up Old Latin, and you're going to see a lot of the same word, but they're not doing the same. They're not working really the same way. So it's in Arabic of his day. Muhammad began to preach his doctrine, which was very simple, really only a variation of the Jewish faith. There are 5 pillars to Islam and a series of cultural and social duties. As you pointed out, Peter, very aptly, it's much more a cultural and legal system than it really is any kind of religious philosophy. The structure of Islam appealed to the desert peoples of Arabia. Also, its message of jihad, or struggle, or holy war, gave Arabian princes and warlords a cause to conquer in the name of this new religion. Islam took over the Arabian Peninsula very quickly and spread like wildfire in North Africa and the Middle East. Here are the 5 pillars: faith, prayer, fasting, almsgiving, and pilgrimage, which is every Muslim is bound to do it. There isn't a whole lot of theology attached with Islam. It is primarily devotional. It leans much more. It looks much more like Judaism than it does like Christianity. But the obligations are much more physical than they are spiritual, and again, it's a very utilitarian religion, very much based on more natural law than anything divine. Here is an example of what the world looked like before the arrival of Islam. The Arabian Peninsula is broken up. You have the Persian dynasty and the Roman Empire with the various kingdoms there. And then here comes Muhammad, and all of a sudden, out, everything spreads out. And I have a little, unfortunately, it automatically starts over. I don't know where it's going to be, but it's kind of here we are, 644, and you can see how Islam spreads very quickly here. North Africa, here it is again, 632, he dies up there, he's spreading out very quickly. Again, this is all within the same year of 633, which is also the year that he died. I think it was 23 to 33. 638. So by 641, again, this is barely 10 years now. You see how fast this goes. They're all the way up in the Byzantine Empire within 10 years, 652, 20 years. The top of North Africa and the entire Byzantine Empire is gone, and much of over here is gone. You see how fast this goes. The troops, the method of, actually, I'm going to jump forward to this for a second and come back to that. Oops. Here we are. This was not evangelization like we've been discussing. Right? They were not going up and saying, "Have you accepted our prophet Islam?" The prophet is, or Allah. With Islam, you either converted or died. There's actually a picture that I looked for and couldn't find of a guy with a Muslim with a knife in his neck, and that's kind of what it was. You either converted or you died. It was much more militant. It was not at all about trying to convince anybody of anything. Muslims' army swept not only through northern Africa, but swallowed up the Byzantine Empire in one generation. They took that entire thing. And I say, you can see here the kind of the warlike attitude that many of the Muslims had. And again, as they swept into these areas, people would convert or would join up. And so you had people of various ancestry all joining up and becoming Islam.
So that's why it spread so fast, because people didn't want to die.
They didn't want to die. Yep, you just joined. There's actually a saying, and I don't remember where there was North Africa of a Muslim. It was a subject of Islam who never met a Muslim. In North Africa, they didn't have many people, so you were under there and you're paying taxes to the whatever, but there were no Muslims immediately in the area. You were paying taxes or they'd come and kill you, but there weren't enough Muslims to really fill it out because North Africa is Christian. So there are actually people who grew up in North Africa as at least nominally Christian, but they were under Islam, but they'd never met a Muslim because the fact that they had taken the area, but they really hadn't. You can see Muslim conquest. So between 632 under Muhammad's only really in charge for 10 years. The whole thing about him going to Medina, gathering up forces, pulling back, taking Mecca. I'll cover a lot more of that in the next one under the spread of Islam. I'll cover more of culturally what Islam looked like. Right now we're just talking about the beginning of it here. But you can see just how quickly this happens. And what it is that they ride across. And what it is that when this army encounters this army, they rode horses. Oftentimes they were desert dwellers. What they wore is they wore silk garments. They did not wear armor. So they were significantly faster than the European forces, many of whom wore armor. And what they would do is if you shot them, the arrow would go in and would take the silk with it. And they could just pull it out again and bind up their arm. So they got hit when they got hit, but it didn't stay in them and they could bind them up. But they were just significantly fast. They didn't wear armor on their horses. They used spears and such, and they were just decimated. North African forces decimated the Byzantine forces. They were not ready for this. It's almost like your blitzkrieg in World War II, where they're ready to get there and start throwing whenever, and all of a sudden in come the tanks. No one was ready for it. So this kind of, again, they were used to traveling long distances because they're from Arabia. They're used to dealing with very little water. They're self-contained for the most part. European armies weren't like that. Again, a lot of foot soldiers, whereas Islam had, because of the desert, knew how to handle horses. So culturally, very different area. And again, nowhere in Europe was ready for this. All right. Our next century, the spread of Islam. Like I said, I'm going to go into it kind of culturally, what it begins to look like, and how it finally gets to its high point. We're not quite to where this. Actually, maybe we are. When they stopped them practically at the gates, they stopped them in France. The birth of Christendom. Now, Christendom, obviously, the idea of a Christian world is the world is becoming more and more Christian. However, the idea of one people under God, kind of, well, that's American, but the idea being is the idea of Christendom, where anyone who's a Christian becomes a fellow, the idea of someone from one country going to somewhere else, and they're both Christians, therefore they get along and receive hospitality, begins to be born in this period of time. And it becomes a great, a great aspect of Europe was it didn't matter what language you spoke, it didn't matter where necessarily you came from. If you were a Christian, could show that you carried a cross or were a Christian, you'd be received, hospitality shown, and it began a great deal of cross-cultural, someone from, if you have it, Anselm, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury, is Italian, but he goes up to England and goes up there and gets involved. And because of the fact that you have this unification mostly of language among the educated, Latin, but also just the idea that anybody who travels over the course of these centuries, more and more, if you are a Christian, are accepted wherever you go, and they'll treat you with kindness, and they'll feed you, and you can actually. So this idea of a Christendom is much more born. The dynastic struggles and further evangelization. You're going to see this now, how the nations of Europe are going to be become more and more cohesive, and they're going to coalesce around the most effective generals, the most effective kings, and Rome is going to play some politics, but it's also going to side. They're going to figure who the winner is, and they're going to side with the winner to make sure that whoever ends up on top is a good Christian and that is loyal to the Pope, and on and on and on. And with that, are there any questions? Kind of a lot of information, but I'll post it and.
This is my favorite series.
Speak louder a bit.
The thing you mentioned about Islam is that there's no real theology attached. They actually say that Islam itself is actually very weak in terms of theology.
It is.
It's only because I even talked to a Bishop who was there. He's like, the whole reason why in reality is because if you actually have enough of education, you can actually see that it's basically a trust. You know how Jesus says, like, house built on sand? Islam, in a lot of ways, is a house built on sand, or so that when you actually look at it from a deep perspective, it actually doesn't make any sense. And they even say that's one reason why a lot of these Islamic countries have low literacy rates, is because the Islamic leaders don't actually want them to learn.
That's interesting.
Because if you look, when you realize what it actually is saying from an educated standpoint, it basically falls out.
It's funny you said it's a foundation built on sand that came from Arabia. So you're actually right on that. Awesome, wonderful. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm